To our breaking news now, President Cyril Ramaphosa's address to the nation on the country's next move with regards to COVID-19. This follows a special sitting of cabinet. Now, for what we can possibly expect and whether we are as a country ready for perhaps further lockdowns and really just the status of the country now as far as our politics is concerned. I'm joined by Mr. Matlala Setlhalogile, who is a political risk analyst. A very good afternoon to you, Matlala. Good to have you with us today. So what do you think South Africans should be expecting come 8 p.m. tonight? We know everybody's holding on to the edges of their seats, especially as they are preparing for the festive season.
Afternoon, Thami. I think it's pretty obvious what to expect later on in terms of the contents of the president's address later on at 8 p.m. Look, South Africa is at a point where it cannot necessarily afford a stricter lockdown, but consequently or contrastingly, it cannot afford a second wave of the coronavirus. We have seen in other parts of the world, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, in advanced economies, where there has been reintroduction of stricter lockdown measures. I think Germany, France, the UK, and all of these various countries have introduced stricter lockdown measures after initially lifting those measures. Look, for the cabinet to endorse a decision that calls for stricter lockdown measures, it could not have been easy. Because remember, the two provinces that are implicated is the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. In terms of the Eastern Cape, the one major metro that is affected is Port Elizabeth, which is the Nelson Mandela Bay. The majority of the Eastern Cape's economic activity happens in Nelson Mandela Bay, while the two economic centers of the Eastern Cape, it's the Buffalo City Metro and the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro. To now introduce stricter lockdown measures in the Nelson Mandela Bay could not have come easily. Most of the hotspots as well in these areas are townships. When you check that, it's going to have a severe impact on the informal economy, especially now that we have witnessed unemployment trends rising in the Eastern Cape based on the Q2 labor force survey. In terms of the the Western Cape as well, it's a similar trend where we see that the hotspots, even though they're in certain urban areas, they happen to be in areas such as Gugulethu and Khayelitsha as well. This will, in all likelihood, should stricter measures be introduced, impact the informal economy.
And what type of an impact ought we perhaps to be expecting from the quote-unquote cosmopolitan areas? You've mentioned the impact here on township and township economies, etc. But what are we likely to see in the areas where the business hubs are paramount?
Look, firstly, I mentioned the informal economy because, in all likelihood, the normal formal economic activities will be permitted to continue with some sort of, I don't see very strict measures taking place in the formal economy. The measures that have been proposed thus far, it's a curfew, it's restrictions on the sales of alcohol, some of these things that have been mentioned. This is likely to have impact on small businesses and to a large extent the informal sector that feeds from these small businesses. But in terms of the mainstream economy, I doubt there'll be very much a substantive impact on that.
And just from your perspective and gauging the sentiments of the country, how has our political leadership thus far dealt with the issue of COVID-19?
Look, I think the political leadership, especially the president and his cabinet, found themselves in a bind because if you check, I think today marks 75% of the year 2020. We as a country have spent that under lockdown. It could not have been easy to stretch the lockdown measures for such a long time, considering that our economy had taken a knock in the first phase of the lockdown. It was already on a downward trajectory prior to the arrival of COVID-19. Uh, but we cannot pit the economy versus health issues, because at the end of the day, health policy ultimately becomes an economic issue as well. Uh, Balancing the promotion of economic activity with the promotion of well-being of society is not necessarily the easiest task to do. The responsibility, in a way, when less strict measures of the lockdown were introduced, was left to us as South Africans. I mean, at the end of the day, whether we have political leadership or not, we as citizens ought to take some level of responsibility. We have obligations to respect, legitimate authority that is vested in our government. We have a role to play in ensuring that the measures that were introduced, we adhere to those. So far, I mean, we have seen that it has not been the case. People have flouted so many of the lockdown regulations that have been introduced thus far. And the responsibility to adhere to those regulations, we as citizens have ignored those. I'm not saying it's entirely our fault that as citizens that we find ourselves in this situation. And hindsight also gives us a bit of an advantage. When the pandemic arrived, it was a new thing. Governments across the globe, not just only in South Africa, did not know how to address it. So we cannot necessarily falter or fault government in terms of how they managed the pandemic. It was a learn as you go exercise on the part of government as well. But now that we have experienced at least a good 6 months, in terms of 6 to 7 or so months in the South African context with the pandemic, we at least have sufficient knowledge on how to carry ourselves as citizens to ensure that the impact of the pandemic is minimized, and we have failed to take responsibility as citizens.
Matlala, I'd like to move on now to the ATM and the motion of no confidence that they're wanting to have passed against the president. We've had various reactions. We've had the DA saying that they're going to sit this out. They're not going to participate in this. We've had the African National Congress calling it a distraction. We spoke to Al Jamaa, who've said it's frivolous. In your view, it does look like it has been a bit of a non-starter. But what impact has this particular motion of no confidence brought by the ATM, what impact has this had on President Cyril Ramaphosa, if at all?
Look, the level of impact is very hard to determine, but I can safely, suggest that there has been a level of, there has been some sort of impact on the president's side, because remember, from the get-go, the formation of the ATM was seen as an extension of the RET faction within the African National Congress. They have made it very clear from the get-go, the ATM, that they're appalled by the manner in which the ANC has led the country. But this is only after the demise of President Zuma's faction in Nazareth 2017. The push for a secret ballot in terms of the motion of no confidence, which in my view is principled, because a precedent has been set in terms of secret ballot when it comes to motions of no confidence. That is highly likely to give President Ramaphosa, some sleepless nights, considering the state or of the ANC, its internal dynamics and the infighting, and linking that to the formation of the ATM. You would remember that the Secretary General of the ANC was at some point linked to the formation of the ATM. But the lack of support that it has received from other opposition parties, the likes of the Democratic Alliance, the UDM, which it claimed that it once supported the motion or partake in the motion based on principle in terms of the failure by the Speaker of the House to implement the secret ballot. Uh, look, it's a non-starter from that perspective. But should the ATM be granted the secret ballot that it requires, I think that might shake the president a little bit. But in the bigger scheme of things, leaving, the opposition parties and everything, this is likely to give a view of unstable political institution in the South African context, and that we marry it with several rating agencies that have commented on the unstable and weakened nature of our public institutions.
Before I let you go, we did speak a bit earlier on to Spumngane, the ATM spokesperson, and he flat out said that there were no links between them and the RET, that they were formed by, senior members of the church, etc. If you could give some insight as to why, if they are in one way or other linked to the RET, linked somehow to Ace Magashule, why it is that they would be refuting this and not coming out in open as the allegations have already been made and the connections already been made.
I mean, coming out and claiming that they are indeed associated with senior members of the ANC would directly put those senior members of the ANC under fire, because they would have brought the party in disrepute. But besides that, there's an important clause in the ANC constitution that says that nobody will work with opposition parties or any opposition parties seeking to undermine the effective running of the organization. Is a very clear clause, which is grounds for expulsion within the ANC.
Well, we thank you so much for your time and your comments this afternoon.